Welcome, everyone, to our event today on women's land rights in Sub-Saharan Africa. It is wonderful to have you all with us here today for our presentation and panel discussion on this important topic. So despite overwhelming evidence on the benefits of women's land ownership for their economic outcomes, as well as wider communities and countries, African governments across Sub-Saharan Africa are reluctant to establish and proactively enforce laws that accord women equal rights to inherit land as men. And we know from recent data from the Women, Business and the Law that 76 out of 190 countries across the world, including 29 in Sub-Saharan Africa, limit women's property rights. And in 19 countries, women don't have equal ownership rights to immovable property. And in 44 countries, men and women do not have equal rights to inherit land as surviving spouses. So across the world, we see these huge differences in access to land between men and women. And we know that these have important implications for women's well-being, children's well-being, communities' well-being, and the economy and society at large. So we are delighted today to bring together recent findings from a CGD working paper, as well as a panel of experts to explore the question and issues of persistent obstacles to women's equal rights to inherit land, as well as practical ways to overcome these obstacles. So my name is Kehinde Ajayi. I am a senior fellow here at CGD and co-director of our program on gender equality and inclusion. I'm going to be joined today by Evelyn Wamboye, who is a non-resident fellow here at CGD and associate professor of economics at Pennsylvania State University in Du Bois. So what we have lined up for you today is a presentation to start off with from Evelyn on recent findings from her work on the paradox of gender equality and economic outcomes in Sub-Saharan Africa, and looking at the role of land rights. So I will pass over to Evelyn to start us off with a presentation, and then we'll move on to a panel discussion with a group of panelists we've gathered together to share their insights on this important topic. Thank you again for being with us here today, and over to you, Evelyn, with your presentation.
Hi, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. I'm glad to be here with my colleagues, and we'll be talking about the women's land rights in Sub-Saharan Africa. So what I'll be doing is just to give an overview, and then my colleagues will provide some specific in some of the questions that may be out there. All right, so just to get us started, to give you the presentation map, so I'll talk about the study objectives, go into the motivation and style as facts, look at the literature review, the key observations, and then conclude with policy recommendations. So its main objective is to analyze the channels through which women acquire land in Sub-Saharan Africa, look at the inherent obstacles, show the relevance of land ownership to gender equality and women's economic and social outcomes, and provide some suggestions to inform effective gender-sensitive land policies.
Sorry, Evelyn, could you please switch to the presentation mode?
It's actually in the presentation mode. Can I just do that again?
Yes, please. Thank you.
It was actually in the presentation mode, so I don't know. Let's see again. How is that? Kehinde, is that in the presentation now? All right, so let me assume everything is okay. So
it's still not in presentation mode.
Women acquire and own land really matter. We have three major channels. They can access that. I mean, they can own land, acquire and own land by the market system. They can also do that via marriage, and they can also acquire and own land by inheritance through birthright. And the problem with the market system is that they need to have the finances. So it's constrained on someone having finances to buy land. And the marriage system or the marriage channel is constrained on the fact that women have to be married. So that leaves out those who are not married. It leaves out single mothers. It leaves out, um, women who could be in cohabiting relationships and all that. And then the inheritance channel, the argument we have is that that is the easiest because their male siblings inherit that by the virtue of just being born in that family. So we argue that the inheritance by birthright is socially and economically empowering, gives women the initial economic advantage as their male siblings. And we focus on the sub-Saharan region because the region is largely agrarian, and therefore, land ownership is important. It determines both the economic and social outcomes of individuals and families, and land and poverty in Sub-Saharan Africa are intertwined. And why women? As you're going to see from studies and from data, that women actually in Sub-Saharan Africa, they depend largely on land because they're the largest producers, of food crops. So in that regard, studies have shown that the multiplier effects of economic and social impact of women's ownership of land are far-reaching compared to those accrued, from men as landlords. So the motivation for this study, we draw some, some findings and what has been shown in literature and in data. And it is shown that women's land ownership is a human rights issue. And also it's centered to women's empowerment, both in economic and social terms. And it's important in achieving food security and overcoming extreme poverty in Sub-Saharan Africa. As I've mentioned before, women are the biggest producers of food crops. If we look at the data as well, it provides a very convincing argument for women to actually inherit land. So we know from the economic structure of the region is that much of the region is rural because a large percent of the population, about 60%, live in the rural areas. And much of that population is women. And we also find that though the agriculture sector is not the biggest sector in the economy, but it's the biggest employer. And find that women who are employed in the sector are a little bit more than the men employed in the sector. And also we note that in this sector, it tends to use family members. And we have this category of workers called the contributing family workers, who are virtually not paid. And women comprise more of that category compared to men. So in essence, women need land just as much as men do because they depend heavily on land, and their families depend on that as well. We also know that much of Sub-Saharan Africa is informal, and 9 out of 10 informal workers are women and youth. And the informal sector contributes about 70% of total employment in the region. And most of the informal sector jobs, they emanate from agriculture and services sectors. Now, so if we look at the data that we have, we don't have much data in this area. And even then, that data doesn't tell us how this land. We find that the difference between the percent that the percent of land that women own compared to that of men, we see that we have a huge difference, 40 percentage points, in a sense that women own about 30% of the land compared to men who own about 70% of the land. And again, we don't know how this land was acquired, whether it was through marriage or inheritance or from the market system. So now moving on to the literature review, I focus mainly on the inheritance channels and also look at the obstacles that women face when they're trying to, I look at the marriage and the inheritance channel and also the obstacle that women face in trying to acquire land. So what has been shown at the marriage channel Studies have shown that this channel does not significantly improve women's economic and social welfare. Also, as I've mentioned before, it leaves out their cohabiting relationships. If we look at the inheritance channel, actually we don't have much literature in this area. But what has been shown is that in patriarchal systems, land is characterized as the property of men, with women enjoying secondary access through the male relations. And justification that is used in the patriarchal system to deny women, ownership of land or even inheritance of land is that women's ownership of land would empower them, encourage unruly behaviors, and discourage or break up marriages. In terms of the obstacles, I can actually just summarize that. I have a number of them, but I can just summarize that in one, the cost. The cost both from the government perspective of implementing whatever laws they have for women to inherit land in the same way as men, and also from an individual perspective to be able to fight for that land, or even to be able to obtain a title when they acquire that land. So what are the key takeaways? Um, that one, that laws that protect women's land rights in marriage do not protect them outside of marriage. So women tend to be steered towards marriage if they want to inherit or acquire such properties, if they want to inherit land or acquire such properties. But we have shown, studies have shown that actually it doesn't, even in cases where we have those rights, they protect women within marriage. But once they're out of marriage, so it could be because of divorce or widowhood, women are not protected. And we have an example of Uganda and Kenya in that study. Also, studies have found that there's an inherent tension in cognition of customary laws that discriminate against women and statutory laws that establish equal rights for men and women. And we see some examples for Tanzania and Cameroon. So in general, we find that life circumstances such as negative impact of HIV and AIDS, divorce or death of a spouse, human displacement, forced evictions, and the recent COVID-19 pandemic leaves landless women and their offsprings economically and socially vulnerable. So in conclusion, for policy recommendations, so many of the arguments, why, women cannot inherit land, through birthright, they tend to focus more on the customs and traditions as if they're static, but in reality, they're not static. So, in that regard, African states should adopt innovative hybrid approaches that combine the best in community and statutory land systems by drawing from community experiences in order to buttress customary land rights, while at the same time ensuring that the rights of women and other marginalized groups are respected. Also, land rights should be seen from as an economic issue. So gender-sensitive land policy should be approached from a perspective of enhancing household welfare and overall economic development rather than from cultural and social lenses. And the issue of education and awareness, which is very key, should be included in the policy implementation packages to be able to sensitize the public about these policies and the importance of women inheriting land. And the legal issues, which include obviously titling once women acquire this land. The titling process should be simplified. Land boards should be staffed with people who are well educated in the laws regarding land rights. And the village committees should be gender balanced, with members purposefully elected by the community. So that ends my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Evelyn, for that presentation, for sharing the insights from your work. You raised some really important issues to consider, that sometimes tension between community and statutory land rights systems and how to reconcile differences across those two when they occur. And then thinking about land rights as an economic issue beyond being a cultural and social issue as it is, recognizing that it really impacts multiple facets of life. And therefore, it's critically important to consider and address these gender gaps. You raised the importance of education and awareness. So even in settings where there are legal provisions to encourage or support, advocate for women's equal access to land ownership, there is still often a gap between awareness and understanding in the broader population about how to access these rights. And then lastly, the fact that there are many legal issues. So it's one thing to establish titling systems and initiate legal reform for land, but then it's necessary to have accompanying measures to actually ensure the effective implementation. So with those points as an introduction, we're going to move now into a panel discussion. So I'd like to introduce our panel of 4 experts who are joining us here today to shed more light on these issues regarding women's land rights in Africa. So we have with us today Daniela Beer, who is an economist with the Women, Business, and the Law team at the World Bank. We have Dan Yaronga, who's Associate Professor of Psychology at State University of New York, Empire State College. Beth Roberts, who's Director of Center for Women's Land Rights at Landesa. And Damsa Thomas, who is a lecturer in the Department of Economics at the University of Bamenda in Cameroon. Thank you all for joining us today. So to start off our discussion, and as you're listening to us talk over here, just a reminder that we will be having time for questions and answers at the end. So please feel free to pop your questions in the chat on YouTube. You can also tweet questions at CGDev. So that we can address them after the discussion. So I'd like to start by turning to you, Daniela. Evelyn had mentioned this in her presentation, and as background, we know a lot about the situation across the world in terms of limited women's access to land and their rights to access land. And so a key part to understanding the patterns in land inheritance and measuring the effectiveness of land policies is really through the availability of historical data so that we can understand where countries are right now, how they've gotten to where they are, and what drives these differences. But very few countries in Sub-Saharan Africa actually collect such data. And often when it is collected, it's not available disaggregated by gender. So what is the cause of this gap, and what do we know about the current situation of women's land rights in the region based on the latest data compiled by Women, Business, and the Law?
Thank you so much, Kehinde, for inviting me to speak, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. I'm very glad that we're discussing women's land rights today, which are so central to women's economic participation and empowerment, as Evelyn also outlined in her presentation. Before we get started, let me share with you a number that I still personally find very hard to believe. As of today, 2.4 billion women of working age all around the world still do not hold the same legal rights as men. And this means that the economic potential of the world still remains largely untapped, given that about half of the population is not able to fully participate. And this is particularly concerning regarding women's rights to own, administer, transact, or inherit property. So at the World Bank Group, we believe that no economy can achieve its full potential without the involvement of both men and women. And therefore, at Women, Business, and the Law, we established a legal index that measures women's economic opportunity across 190 economies. And our most recent report just came out on March 2nd, so I invite you all to take a look at it. It's a really interesting report with many new interesting findings, some of which I'm going to present today for Sub-Saharan Africa particularly. So as Kehinde mentioned in the beginning of the talk, 76 economies still constrain women's property rights in one way or another. So let's take, for instance, Hélène Thiraud, who is a woman in a small village in Côte d'Ivoire. For more than 20 years, Hélène lived on and cultivated her land that provided for her, her husband, and her children. But when her husband passed away due to electoral violence in 2011, everything changed for her and her life. In accordance with customs, the property was given to the extended family, leaving her with no place to go and no food for her children. And also she had no legal recourse either, as at that point in Cote d'Ivoire, women did not have equal rights to immovable property and equal administration over assets during marriage. Fortunately, in 2019, this was no longer the case, and a recent reform to the marriage law overhauled these discriminatory provisions. And this is just one example of how legal reform can have really impactful impacts on women's life. And this is exactly what we measure under women, business, and the law. Now, in Sub-Saharan Africa, as of today, women hold only about 3/4 of the rights of men in the area of property ownership, including land. In other regions, such as Europe, Central Asia, Latin America, or OECD, it's close to 100%. So really much work still lies ahead for the continent to bring women and men on an equal level field in like owning, administering, transacting, and inheriting property. And historical data, as Kehinde mentioned, is really important to track progress over time. At Women, Business, and the Law, we provide like panel data sets stretching 52 years, where we are able to track women's legal rights progress over time. And it shows that over 5 decades on assets, the indicator which measures property rights for both men and women, had one of the lowest increases over time, only 18 points from 63 to 81, and 100 obviously being the best score. One example that I just want to give you is Uganda, which became the first sub-Saharan African country to implement comprehensive reforms on its inheritance law since 2011, when last Mali equalized inheritance rights for men and women. In 2022, Uganda instituted new reforms and enacted a Succession Amendment Act, amending and adopting gender-neutral language and specifically removing provisions that favored male heirs over female heirs. Now, sons and daughters, as well as male and female surviving spouses, have equal inheritance rights. Overall, data is really fundamentally important for addressing key developmental challenges around the world, and measuring progress for women is not an option. It is a necessity. We can only address problems that we know of, right? Yet the reality is that our knowledge is really limited, and available data and the level of disaggregation of these data is really limited. Yet these data are really key to unlocking a better future for women, but also for men and societies as a whole.
Thank you so much, Daniela, for your insights on the importance of data. And this leads us very naturally to the question, the next question that I'm going to ask to Ndamsa Thomas about what are based on your latest research on gender equity and land distribution in Cameroon, why is equal access and inheritance of land in Sub-Saharan Africa important from an economic, social, and political standpoint?
Thank you for inviting me to speak on this very important topic on women's land rights in Sub-Saharan Africa that has great potentials to enhance the contribution of women to the economy, to social and political development as a whole. I don't know if I can get Hunter to share my slide, so I'll continue. Hunter, thank you. Thank you very much for having me speak on this very important topic concerning women's potential and the economy as a whole. I will not overlook what has been said by Professor Wamboyo and Daniela. I will not go back to that. But the key things we have to know is that in Sub-Saharan Africa, women form a majority in agriculture, and they contribute well over 60% of the labor share. But despite all this, women are still facing a lot of challenges in accessing or inheriting land in Sub-Saharan Africa. We have state laws that are very sound, and that protect women's right to own land. But beside the state, we have customary practices that are going contrary to the state laws. What we must know is that current research and policy attention is towards the direction of revising these customary practices that are inhibiting the women from accessing land and contributing fully to economic and social development in Africa as a whole. Based on current research and on a paper that is forthcoming in the Journal of African Development, allowing women or female household heads without access to land ownership to gain such access is pro-food poverty. I mean, it's going to help us to reduce poverty and hence enabling us to ensure food security in Africa and in Sub-Saharan Africa in particular. These findings are in tandem to political positions of the Food and Agricultural Organization, with the Sustainable Development Goals, and even with so many national policy documents. To mention Cameroon, we have the Growth and Employment Strategy Paper 2019, which supports the findings of our paper. If we allow women to access land, this will enable us to effectively fight hunger in Sub-Saharan Africa, as intimated earlier by the previous speakers. Poverty is a serious problem in Sub-Saharan Africa, which has been on an increase since 2014. Next slide. Hunter, we move to the next slide. Allowing women to access land and own land will also help to empower them. Many programs organized around landed property or farming have to do with training and capacity building. And such programs are organized by government agencies and non-governmental organizations. The women who own land will also benefit from such training and capacity building. And land serves too as a collateral when it comes to accessing finance from the banking system in Africa, especially the market system, which is gradually gaining strength in our sub-region. So this will allow women to access credit. And when we talk of accessing credit, the women will have to build their potential to guarantee more savings in order to remain valid or more worthy in the financial system. And giving women land that serves as a collateral to permit them to build other social networks. A woman, land is an asset. A woman with access to land and who can easily obtain credit from the banking system can also be a better person in the society. For instance, she can be part of associations. She can be part of social networks that will build her capacity further. We should not forget, as intimated by the previous speaker, that women are the breadbasket of every household. Meaning they have great potentials to make every household better. Because evidence has suggested or has shown women, majority of the money that comes to women is spent on providing food, is spent on providing children's needs. So empowering a woman or empowering our women by allowing them to access land, not necessarily fighting with the men, is not just going to end at the level of their families, but would end up empowering the whole society. One thing we have to note, or one thing that came out from our paper, is that the tussle, what I've called here, man equals to woman in land ownership, is not actually pro-food poverty. Meaning, we are not saying the women should fight the men or be like the men when it comes to land ownership. What we're saying is just that a woman with that land should be given access to own use land for productive purposes. Then we would end up fighting poverty effectively in Sub-Saharan Africa in particular. Allowing our women to access land to will permit them, if they can have more extensive surfaces, to move from subsistence agriculture to commercial-based type of agriculture that can generate more income to as a whole. The fact that if women are given, then this can go a long way to reduce domestic violence. I think highlighted something already in this regard, because a woman will be respected more in her marriage if the husband sees her as important in marriage. The husband sees her as content. She has property, landed property, immovable property that is important to the family. So the husband respects her. And a woman too that has access to what I call an asset, property, can also negotiate certain terms in the marriage. Even coming to negotiating the number of children we should have, negotiating some family planning methods was appropriate, the woman has more power. And in the worst where the woman feels violated in the marriage and she has landed property, it's easy for her to evict the marriage and still continue coping. Next slide, Hunter. Thank you for moving to the next slide. Now, on the political standpoint, as intimated earlier, women's access to landed property is a fundamental human right. About land, but other properties, other immovable properties. Women have to have the same right as men to access landed properties and other properties. It's a fundamental human right, as intimated here. And according to Mission Refugees, improving a women's land right is key to democracy, peace, and justice. One thing I want to underscore here is that many a times participation in electoral processes or even in election is based on what the individual has to protect in that country. If a woman has this social asset that we call land, she feels like I have something to protect in my country, in my community. So if there are elections, I should be able to determine who best rule or can best run the rules and regulations of our country so my property is better protected. So if women are not given such rights, most often than not, they will not find any reason to be joining the political process in determining who rules the country because they have very little. So giving the women access to own and to control land is going to enhance the political participation. We have examples of women who own land or women who are farmers who have gone into politics with similar reasons that I just raised. Like in the US, we have Audrey Denny and Emily Bess. When you read their reasons for joining politics, it was because they felt like them were not doing it. They feel like they should go in and so that they can do it well to support even farming and support other people in the society. So in conclusion, earlier, we should land just from the cultural perspective, from the cultural lens, or we should view land from the economic, social, and political lenses. This will allow us to revise or to reform our policies based on these lenses, not based on cultural systems. And one thing we must understand or we must underscore is that the sort of patriarchal society we are inside has limited the role of women and the potentials to contribute to development. For instance, in many societies, power is given to men by the customary practices. And the laws are very clear that women and men have equal rights. So it is high time there should be a match between the customer practices in every country in Sub-Saharan Africa and the state laws. Meaning the states are going left, or they're going right, let me put it that way. The state laws are going right, while the customer practices in most Sub-Saharan African countries are going left. So it is high time we should
Thank you
match,
very much for those
or they should customer
for
practices.
those
Thank you
insights and
for
broadening our perspective on what the importance is of gender equity in land distribution. And you've been building on the data that we know about the gaps that exist and the compelling evidence on what the impacts are of broadening access, women's access to land. We'll now turn to our remaining panelists to address the question of how to overcome these obstacles. So starting with you, Beth, what do you think are the major obstacles to women's equal access and inheritance of land through birthright? And how do you think these obstacles can be addressed?
Thank you, Candy. And thank you to everyone who's attending and to my fellow panelists. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, everyone. So the major barriers to women's realizing their inheritance rights. We've heard quite a bit already on barriers to land inheritance for women, but I want to summarize the key barrier that inhibits women's land inheritance, and then summarize a couple of other barriers from that flow from that key barrier. And that key barrier is social norms. So you've heard Evelyn and Daniela and Damsa talk about these social norms and these barriers. I want to talk in terms at the very highest level in terms of CEDAW reservations. So we see almost universal adoption of CEDAW across the world. My country, the US, is one of the few exceptions to countries that have ratified CEDAW, but almost all countries in Africa have ratified CEDAW. But when we look at where there are reservations to the CEDAW Convention, they're grouped around the articles of CEDAW that relate to women's property rights, and specifically to social norms related to women's property rights. So when we look at Article 2, that calls for shifting legislation and discriminatory laws that limit women's equal rights. There are large numbers of reservations there. There are large numbers of reservations around Article 5, which is specific to cultural norms and beliefs and attitudes that prevent women's equality. So specific to social norms and cultural norms that hinder women's equality with men. And then specifically Article 16, which includes Article 16H, which is equality with property and ownership of land. And this combination of reservations points to the depth of the resistance that we see to women accessing, owning, and controlling land on an equal basis with men. There is this undergirding belief that land is not for women, that land is predominantly a male purview, and we see this very pervasively across Sub-Saharan Africa. And we see this despite progress in enshrining legal rights to land at the international level, at the regional level through AU policies and AU standards, including related to family law. The Maputo Protocol and Article 7D guarantees equal property rights, marital property rights for women. And then national laws. We've seen enormous progress over the last few decades in seeing changes to family law and specifically to inheritance law, including the example Daniela shared about the Succession Act in Uganda. So really exciting progress in terms of enshrining and moving the needle in terms of legal standards, but still in terms of realizing women's land rights at the household level. Social norms are an enormous barrier. The belief is that land belongs to men, and that women, and what we see as a result is that women access land only in secondary ways, that women's rights are, as others have said, generally fairly secure within marriage, but then when there is a shift within marriages, when there's a divorce, when a husband migrates to an urban center for work, through any number of circumstances, a woman can lose her rights to land and they revert to the family. And this takes different forms depending on matrilineal or patrilineal communities. It is highly contextually specific, but we see we see a lot of commonalities in many different contexts related to this very widespread belief that land is a man's purview. So social norms is the biggest driver of preventing women from fully realizing their inheritance rights. Implementation or lack of implementation is also a big barrier. So we see a lack of institutional strength related to laws that are in place for women's land rights. We see a lack of awareness for government officials at all levels, from national to subnational, and particularly to local levels. And this interacts with the legal pluralism that my colleagues have talked about as well. So when there is a discrepancy between the formal legal frameworks and customary legal frameworks, there is a lack of certainty about how to implement and certainly how to enforce laws related to women's land rights. This also relates to legal awareness for women themselves and for men who might be willing to support women in realizing their rights as well. When women are not aware of their rights, when men are not aware of women's rights, women are not able to claim, to pursue, and to enforce their rights to inheritance. And this also relates to social norms and the notions of what it is to be a good woman often lead to women relinquishing their inheritance rights even when they are aware of the fact that they do have a right to inherit. They may be fully aware that they have the legal right to claim inheritance, but they may cede that right to a husband, to a brother, because the social pressure to do so is so strong. A further barrier.
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, I'll wrap up with this if I'm running short on time. And one final barrier I'll point to is just conflicting incentives for government officials. So when we think about land use and land management at the national level, governments are thinking about development. Governments are thinking about what will drive economic development. Women's land rights may be fairly low on that list. So we're thinking about what will support commercial agriculture, what will service sovereign debt, what will support leveraging mineral resources within a given country, what will support climate action within a given country. And there is a disconnect between the power of gender equality and securing women's land rights to address the climate crisis, the soil crisis, the biodiversity crisis, the food security crisis, and the ability at the national level, policies that relate to securing women's land rights to affect those ends. I'll leave it there, Kehinde, and turn it back over to you.
Thank you very much, Beth, for that perspective on the importance of the social norms and addressing those as a barrier to overcoming those as an obstacle to expanding women's access to land. So now we'll turn over to our final panelist. And as we are setting up this, moving on to this final question, I want to remind you all in the audience to put your questions in the chat if you have any questions, or you can also tweet to at CGDev, and we will open up to Q&A shortly. So building on what Beth mentioned, I wanted to turn to you, Dan, to address this question about what some of the cautions of moving ahead in terms of land reform and the potential negative impacts of land titling and formalization of land. Because although that on its surface seems like it could be a powerful way to expand women's access to land, it can also be used as a way from land access and ownership. So, there's some research that cautions that since titles define primary legal ownership, it's still possible for men to use customs and traditions as a way to kind of encourage women to relinquish their rights to land and support men as being the sole holder or legal bearer of the title deed. So how can the issue of land titling in Sub-Saharan Africa be addressed to ensure that it is actually, in practice, a mechanism for expanding women's access to land rather than being a tool for reinforcing gender differences in access to land?
Thank you, Kehinde. I really appreciate, and thanks to the host CGD for having us to discuss the issue of land in Africa. And thanks also to my colleagues or panelists in the discussion. If I was to give you a short, one straight answer to that question, it will be just one thing: education. Education, education, education. But then there are a lot of complexity that colleagues have brought up, that just education alone is not sufficient for this. Education is good, but there's so much to it. Look at the data. When you are told that 90% of the total land in the Sub-Saharan Africa is unregistered and untitled, that gives you a pause to question how can the continent develop, or even those women or even men themselves get a title and take to the bank to get a loan to be able to develop. When you are told 60% of this land is under customary law or traditional. Now, there's this belief still in Africa that, much as everybody live in the city or work in the city, but the home is in the rural area. Still, people believe that. When I address this question, I want to look at the context itself and take you back to Africa and how it is and how geographically people are living in Africa. When this woman is married in this family, the structure is already set. The structure is already there for her to see. It may be a non-verbal, an unwritten, an undisclosed prenuptial agreement about what she's getting into. You are introduced to the uncles and the cousins and the brothers and the sisters and everybody in the family. And you are shown where the burial place is and where the land is that you'll be able to use for farming. But you are not told anything beyond that. Because somebody is married to a family where perhaps even this land that you are married into or the family you are married into, your spouse does not have total ownership of that land to begin with. The person is married to the community or to the entire family. It's a more of a communal land. So the power lies with the great patriarch, who is the great-great-grandfather. After the marriage, and you probably have the kids, is when you are allocated a land. You get out of the homestead. Now you have your own place. When you have your own place, it does not mean it is yours at that point. In Western culture, when people get married, you take a time. Let's go look for a home, and we're going to look for how the kitchen look like, the bedroom look like. This is where. No, it's not like that. Because the moment you settle in that little piece of land given by the great-grandfather to be your homestead, moving from the bigger home area, before you know it, the husband married a second wife and a third wife. So at that point, you pause, like, where is my land? And the land itself does not have a title deed. So there are so many complexity with regard to the land ownership. And as Evelyn mentioned at the beginning, that the ownership is passed on to the sons. And then, unless it's a single woman, and even at the time of death, when you think now you're going to inherit this land, the uncles and the cousin are more interested in inheriting the wife, not even the land. So there's another complexity, so that they have more and more power with regard to the land ownership. But there are a number of areas that we can look at in terms of addressing the issue of land in Africa. And there are many governments that have come up with different policies. These are not uniform type of policies, whether you talk about Uganda, whether you talk about Tanzania or Malawi or Niger or Nigeria. There are places like Nigeria whereby they just nationalize the land. And in Tanzania, they have different other policies, like for public land, private land, and customary land. But the challenges remain despite some of these issues in terms of addressing them. One challenge is with regard to the political will to be able to implement these that have been made. these politicians get their vote from the rural people who vote for them or their own constituents. How do they enforce it? Much as they may pass the law, but enforcing it become a challenge to this. There's a low education attainment for this. Most of those who sit even in the land board at the village level, majority are either standard 7 leavers who have not attained higher level of education and have no clue with regard to the law, with regard to for the land. So most of them are not aware of their legal right or freedom beyond what they have been told when they got married into the family. There is also external pressure that the moment you pick up that case, which is very sensitive, a lot of people tell you to let go because you cannot win it. The mother did not win it. The grandfather did not. Nobody can win it because of that kind of pressure. So you are kind of overpowered and you have no place where to go. There's also fear of witchcraft. That is something that nobody will talk about. They're told, don't even touch it because you're gonna be dead before you know it. So a lot of women don't even want to talk about the issue of, and there's intimidation and blackmail as well with regard to, oh, leave it, it is for the husband. You don't want to mess up your family. You're breaking the marriage. So all those kind of challenges are there. How do we address these issues? Number one, the government have a lot of land in Africa. The government, they own a tract, they have a lot of land and they give even this to business people called economic processing zone. I don't understand why they cannot prioritize women being given some of that land to be able to use for commercial purposes. I do not understand. The introduction of land rights education in school. I do not understand why the education system cannot put that in place so that kids, including young boys and girls, know their right from day one in school, in elementary school, as they go. So education system need to be changed to go with the time as opposed to going with the traditional beliefs and how that should be done. Developing of village bylaws. These bylaws need to be changed and to have this gender quota in terms of determining who sit in those board. And I'm not talking about the number in those board that sit to make a decision about land decision. I'm talking about even leadership. Even if it means rotating, that you have a woman at the chair of that board, that need to be done instead of just having these old men who are respected. That is fine, but they also need the balance so that they have a say. So something as free land registration. I don't see why a government would ask for this money from that poor person in the village to have a title deed when they know the situation. There's no reason to ask for that. They can have a free title deed for all these people who own this land instead of charging them money when they're poor and they cannot. And that is something they need to do. I also have to encourage joint ownership of this land as opposed to just, much as I know there's little that can be done on that joint ownership, but their policy area with regard to education, with regard to free land registration, those are some of the things can be done, and distributing land to these women because they are doing it for those who are doing business through these economic processing zones. Those can be done without a problem. And then the last one, I don't know, and this is something that is even in the West is a problem. When a husband passed on or is gone, the issue of will is a problem that is even in the West. There are people who die without leaving a will. So if that is something that can be encouraged by a lot of these groups, whether you talk about Tanzanian Women Lawyers Association or Zambia National Land Alliance or Rwanda Land Alliance or Namibia NGO Federation, I mean, all these land alliances that are at the national level, they can work hard to make sure that these people have education with regard to how, with the importance of having a living will, so that when the widow is left, at least there is something written and the law is able to recognize that, this person is passed on, relatives are not going to fight over the land that is left by the person, or uncles are going to fight over it because there's a living will. That is something that these organizations need to fight for. In addition to that, they need to educate those who sit in education in the land board at the local level, so that they are aware of some of the rights that women need to have, because majority are not that much educated. Majority are up to standard 7 leavers.
Thank you very much for those really thoughtful insights on what the different aspects of the issue are and what are ways to address it. So we have time for one question before we wrap up. So I'll ask Beth for you to keep the response brief. This is a question that we are getting from the chat, which is for Beth, which is: given the several barriers for legal implementation of land inheritance rights, do you have a good practice country examples of implementing land inheritance rights? And what are these implementation measures that policymakers should prioritize to enforce land inheritance rights? So I'll ask you, Beth, in 1 minute to give us an example and thoughts on what should be prioritized.
I'll give a really quick example tying off of what Dan just said about wills. So one of our partners in Uganda, it's an organization called UKOBAC, they've developed a social norms and behavior change curriculum called Securing Your Family's Future, which does classes with groups of women and groups of men to talk about why is it important to secure women's land rights, including developing a will for the family that secures a widow's rights to inherit after her husband passes. And they've been able to develop a male champions program for having families write wills, which has become quite widespread, and they've had a number of men become very vocal champions for this program. So one example there, it takes quite a lot of time and resources, but that is the kind of social norms transformation that is needed to see implementation of laws that are in place and shifts within the family, and that will help to actually realize women's rights in practice.
Thank you very much, Beth, for giving us a positive example to end on, some hope and optimism. Thank you, Alexis, for submitting that question. So we've coming to the end of our event together. We started with Evelyn's presentation outlining what we know about the current situation in Africa in terms of women's access to land and what some of the challenges are, and some key policy implications. So I encourage you to read more about that. The paper and the blog post are both available on the CGD website. We talked about the issues with understanding more broadly what the context is given access to data. And as Daniela mentioned, the latest edition of the Women, Business and the Law data has just been released. So you can go there to learn more about differences in women's rights and across the world, not just in access to land, but a broader spectrum of things. We talked about both from the perspective of broader understanding what the broader implications are of land rights and why it's not just a question of effects on culture and social and society, but real economic implications and why this is an important issue to address. And then we ended with some optimism about what things are, concrete things are that we can to move the needle on this issue. So thank you all for being with us here. I'd like to thank our panelists and our presenter for really expanding our understanding of this issue. We encourage you to continue the conversation. You can engage with us on Twitter. You can come back and watch this. We'll share the presentations online. Thank you all. Have a wonderful rest of the day.